Hi everyone, Joseph Koensgen here. Welcome back to my art studio. Today I'm excited to show you how I paint the swans in the painting you see behind me on my easel here. Now this is a really dynamic scene, and birds with white feathers reflect all this light and shadow that's around them. So from the bright white sunlight to the deep blue shadows, I'm going to build this up layer upon layer, and I think these swans are going to be perfect for this painting. So let's get started. The colors I'm using in this painting are going to be ultramarine blue, raw umber, yellow oxide, cadmium red light, alizarin crimson, Mars black, titanium white. And the brushes I'm using are a round number 4, a round number 2, a round 1, and a round 0. Alright, so I'm going to start by making kind of a darker value for my shadow color on the swans. Some titanium white, ultramarine blue, darken it a bit with the Mars black, a bit more blue, and then maybe just a touch of the alizarin crimson. Maybe just a bit more white. Okay, there we go. So I can start by using this color to block in my shadows for the swans. This is my reflected sky color. And I'm just going to get a general idea and put in some basic shapes of where I think these shadows should be. The feather details and the sunlight on these birds is going to be really complex. So these two swans are going to take me about 5 days to paint, or 30 to 40 hours total. But that time and that patience and effort is going to be totally worth it in the end, because I think these swans are going to look great and they're going to really bring this scene to life. So I'll just put this blue color down. It's not quite as strong as the blue in the background. I really want these swans to stand out from this snowy background. So some of the colors I might make slightly lighter, and especially the highlights are going to be really bright and really distinct. For a lighter color for that blue, I can just add some white to that mixture that I already made. I need to add a bit more blue. So now I can take this little bit of a lighter blue color just for that mid-range value that's slightly lighter than that darker shadow I just put on. And this is where you get a bit of that crossover from the bright white highlights to the reflected blue skylight on the other side. And I want to be careful here, especially when I start adding some of the yellows and some of that glowing white color. The sun at the low angle in the winter here is going to create a lot of complexity, especially in this swan that's in the foreground, where the feathers are kind of loose and the wings are sitting slightly away from the body. So I'm just going to block in both birds at the same time right now with some of my base colors here. I don't mind a little bit of variation once I start doing the detail and working on them individually, but for now these base colors are good just to have a bit of color harmony between the two of them. And now the base color for the highlight on the swan. I'll start with the white, little bit of the yellow oxide, some raw umber, maybe just a tiny bit of that alizarin crimson, a little bit of black just to dull it slightly. Okay, there we go. So now I can add this kind of off-white, slightly yellowish color to where the highlights are going to be. And I like to have everything generally blocked in before I start adding detail, just to give me a good idea of the tones and the values of where everything's going to be, and then I can judge a little bit more accurately the depth of the shadows and the brightness of the highlights. It just kind of helps me get a sense of the bird and the look as a whole, rather than working on tiny little sections at once without any color down. And this base color for the highlights here, this kind of off-white, slightly yellowish color, is going to really help with that glowing look that I want these swans to have. The base color for the beak and the legs, start with my Mars Black, some raw umber, some alizarin crimson, and maybe I'll just grab a little bit of that blue mixture, just so it's not too dark just yet. So now I can block in the beaks and the legs. And this color's quite dark. You know, the swan's bills and the feet are going to be mostly in shadow, and I don't want them to have a ton of detail, but just kind of enough to give a suggestion of the shape. It's going to add some really nice contrast with how dark these colors are and how light the swan's feathers are going to be. And I think just overall, generally, it'll make a little bit of these elements in this scene just pop really, really nicely. So again, just simple shape and a little bit of color down just so I have an idea. Sometimes with certain parts of the animal, like the feet on these swans, you can get away with not as much detail. The most important thing that I like to focus on is shape and proportion. And then if you add just a tiny bit of detail on top, it really adds to the realism if the shape and the size looks correct for the animal in the scene. Then I can mix a shadow color, which is very similar to the colors I had for blocking in, but it's going to be a little bit darker, a little bit more blue because it's going to be in the darker part of the shadow. And for some of the shadows, I like to have a little bit more of the alizarin crimson. I find if there's a bit of a deeper shadow and it's got a slightly purple tint to it, that looks better in the shadows. So now I can start building up some of those shadows and details in this first swan here. Sometimes I find with animals or birds that have white fur or white feathers is that I want to get the shadows right and not too dark. Sometimes I find if they look too dark, the fur or feathers looks like it's dirty rather than just in shadow and reflecting the light coming from the opposite direction of the sun. So I want to start the shadows off a little bit lighter, and then I can slowly add darker and darker colors as I progress and go along to make sure that those shadows look clean and natural and still make it look like the feathers have a bright white look to them even though they are in a dark shadow. And when I want to soften edges and make colors a little bit lighter, I can always go back to this mixture that I had before and lighten it or darken it, but I just want to remember that adding white or adding black will always make the color a little bit more dull, so I have to keep adding my ultramarine blue and my alizarin crimson just to keep some of that color in this mixture. Okay, now I can soften some of that shadow color that I had in there before, and this variation on color is very, very slight, and in fact, most of the colors that I'm going to be using here, the variation either being lighter or darker is going to be very slight, just so I get that nice, soft, rounded look. Now, something I've noticed on the swans in this scene, and especially in most sunlit scenes, is that the part where the shadow meets the highlight part, that's often where you can have your darkest shadow line, especially if you have a strong reflected light source from a bright sky coming from the opposite direction. It might seem a little counterintuitive to have some of the darker parts of your shadow right next to your highlight color, but when I look at the reference photos and when I look at some of the pictures I've taken of these bright sunlit animals, there's just ever so slightly a darker line and a darker shadow right next to the highlight color. Now I am going to balance this off by adjusting that shadow color, but generally speaking, you're going to have this slightly darker shadow line right next to your highlight. Then I can go in and start adding some of that reflected light, which is going to give me that nice sense of a bright sky from the opposite direction. Making sure to not start out too light just yet. Adding a little bit of that feather detail that's on the swan's neck. And then I can add just a little bit of a lighter color here, just for that extra little bit of brightness. And I think it really gives it that nice sense of reflected light. There's not a ton of feather structure in the swan's neck, but I want to just give a little bit of a hint, and that reflected light really helps with that. And for the edges of the highlight, I just want to make another color that's similar to my highlight color base layer. A bit more yellow oxide, just a deeper color that's going to be right on the edge where the highlight and the shadow meet. And then I can add this color to the edge of the highlight where it meets the shadow, just to kind of help it give that sense of shape where the light kind of rolls off into the shadow, and this slightly deeper yellow is just going to give it that nice three-dimensional look. And then I'll go a little bit darker here, giving just a little bit stronger sense of shape, helping that shadow and that light kind of meet nicely in the middle. Then I can bring some of that yellow color just a little bit onto the swan's head, just because sometimes their heads have this little bit of a yellowish tint. For the line on the bill that's a little bit orange, I can use this cadmium red light with a little bit of raw umber. Just want to create kind of like a rusty orange color, maybe just a touch of white, tiny little bit of black. Okay, and then I'll just fill in that line where you have the separation between the top part of the bill and the bottom. And I'm going to keep this color quite dark. Normally it's a little bit of a brighter red, but of course because it's in shadow, it's going to be a little bit darker than normal. Then I can just clean up that shape and that edge. And this is where that fine point of my round number 1 brush really comes in handy here. So now I'm just going to add a little bit of detail onto the beak, and I think I'm going to keep it fairly basic. Just a few of these lighter blue highlight lines just to kind of give it that shape and that structure. Everything's fairly small, so I want the details to stand out properly and to make sense. And then I can just do a nice fine highlight right on the edge of the beak. Just a little above the nostril. And then for the eye, because it's quite small in the painting, the little highlight doesn't need to be a lot. Just a tiny little dot of a bit of a gray. And then I can come in with just a little bit of white and just leave the tiniest little shine, and that should be perfect. My highlight color is going to be titanium white with just a touch of the yellow oxide. This is not going to be my brightest highlight color, which will be just titanium white. This, I want a little bit of a color to it, so I've got that yellow oxide in there. And then adding this highlight really starts to bring the swan to life and that feeling of sunlight and that direction of light. And what I'm going to do here is keep my brightest highlights to the outside edge of the swan's head and neck, and then slowly bring them in towards the center to the shadow line. This is going to help further emphasize that rounded shape and really give it that three-dimensional look. And then just following a lot of those feather shapes that I had already put in there with my base colors. So just bringing in some finer details and just a little bit more feather separation, as the sun is only getting just a few of the highest feathers as it gets closer and closer to that shadow line in the center. Then I was going to add a little bit more of this red color just because I felt like it needed a little bit more of that tint on the swan's head. And then I can take just titanium white and go along the outside edge just to further give it that little bit of brightness. Okay, that's a great start for that first swan. It has a nice three-dimensional shape, a little bit of a glowing quality. It's got that nice bright sunlight feeling, and so far I think that looks great. And now onto the swan's body. I can start by blocking in all these different feather details and shapes. The feathers on the underside of the swan are all kind of stacked in these really tight little layers, and so they all have these little curved shapes to them. But that's going to work to our advantage because it's going to help in really showing that curved look and that rounded shape of the swan's body. So here I'm just blocking everything in, trying to build the shadow. I'm not being as precise with these because I know I'm going to go over it in multiple layers, both with highlight and in shadow. So here I just want to loosely block everything in and just focus a little bit more on getting that rounded look and shape, and then I can go in and further refine and further detail all these feathers. Then I can just block in some of the shadows on the underside, which are going to be a little bit darker than I expected. And then get some of the feathers that are just behind the neck, where there's going to be a really interesting reflecting light off the swan's neck onto the swan's back. And then I can start in with a little bit of a lighter color, and now I can refine some of those details and start to get that look of the reflected skylight onto all these feathers. This is also where I can start to soften some of these edges of all these feathers that I had just blocked in. Being careful to just build that shape and put all those feathers in the right place. And just like I had done on the swan's neck, I am going to do sort of a build-up of shadow and highlight in this shadow part of the swan. I just want to make sure that I don't get my shadows too dark too quickly. And I'm just going to build it up sort of one value at a time, switching back and forth sometimes between lighter and darker, just to try and get that feel and that look of that nice and clean and crisp shadow color. And then I can bring some of that shadow color up into the highlighted area where we're getting a few darker shadows, where the light begins to roll off into the fully shadowed area. And the reason it's going to take a little bit longer and I want to build these shadows slowly is that the background and the swans are from two different pictures. And so I want to match the lighting on the swans to the lighting in my background, and matching some of that background color where I've got that really strong blue color, and constantly looking back and forth to make sure that the shadows on the swan and the depth of the shadows on the swans match the depth of the shadows in the background. So I'm always making small adjustments to my colors, either making a duller blue or a stronger blue, just so that it makes sense for the scene and so that all the colors fit together. Now I can go in with a little bit of a darker shadow color, and I can go in between each one of these little feathers, build a little bit more separation, give them each a little bit of a darker shadow. This will add a little bit of contrast and give it a bit more depth. Again, just following the contours of all of those feathers. And you can see I'm being pretty delicate here. The further along I get and the more refined I get in the details, the sharper I can be and the more I can kind of slow down and just build in all these little details. And then I noticed that I could make the shadow on the belly of the bird just a little bit darker. And I really like to do my shadows this way, building the shadows light to dark rather than dark to light. it really helps me control the depth of the shadows, where I can start light and continually go darker and darker and darker, rather than trying to guess how dark I should be in the first place and then trying to build my highlights on top. This way, in the shadows and in the highlights, I can start from the middle with a nice mid-range value and build out the shadows and highlights in either direction, making them as dark as I need them to be or as bright as I need them to be. And then I'm just going to take a little bit of a lighter color, soften a few more of these edges. The belly of this swan has a really nice smooth look, so I just want it to have a little bit of like a hard look to it, sort of like a shell of feathers that surrounds the belly of this swan. And then I think I'm going to go just a little bit darker here. Just kind of use this just in a few different spots, just to give it a tiny bit more contrast. This is where kind of gauging the look and the feel of the background and building up those shadows, going from my mid-range value to dark, is really helpful. And so even just a small amount of this shadow to the underside of the swan has really helped give it a much better sense of a direction of light. So now I can start adding some lighter colors to build in some of these highlights, a little bit of that reflected light between the swan's neck and the back. And then I can add a bit of this yellowish tan color that's underneath, where you're getting light reflecting off the snow and the ice just onto the bottom edge of the swan's belly. And that little kind of glowing part, I think, really added that sense of light bouncing around all over the place in this very bright winter scene. And then a little bit of a reflected light area where there's going to be some light bouncing off of the other swan onto this swan's body and wing. And I really want to get that little kind of glowing area where you're getting a lot of light reflected down from the swan's neck onto the swan's back. I just love this little section right in here where you're getting all this light bouncing around everywhere. And it's these little details that just help with the realism so much. So now I'm just going to take a lighter blue color. This is going to be the lightest color that I'm going to be using for the shadow areas, just on some of the top edges of these feathers where the skylight is going to be lighting them the most. I don't want this color to be as bright or look as vibrant as my sunlight area, but I just want to give it a little more brightness, kind of add some of that contrast, which is also going to help with giving it the rounded shape I want it to have. I don't want to overdo this, just in a few areas and a little bit of that overlap into the bright area. And then I want to just clean up the highlighted area with that base color that I had used before. And then I'm just going to overlap into some of these areas, just bring some of that highlight in, some of that reflected light onto the side, just in the areas where that light is going to be just shining into that shadow area. Then I can start in with my bright highlight. This is my titanium white with just a bit of yellow oxide. And then I can start building in all this feather structure. And what's great here is that this kind of yellowish off-white color that I put in for the base is going to show through the gaps that I'm leaving, and it's really going to help give it that nice warm glowing look, because at this time of the year the sun is low in the sky. It's got that slightly yellow color, so each one of these little subtle shadow areas in the sunlit part where the light kind of rolls off into where the feathers break, and it's just going to add a nice sense of depth in this highlighted area. And there's a little bit of a feather that kind of sticks up just a little bit. And And then I'm kind of going back over some of these areas just to really help with that brightness. And then I felt like I could go just a little bit lighter on some of these edges here. I know before I had said that that other color was going to be the brightest, but once I had the bright highlights of the sunlit area in there, I felt like a few of these feathers just needed that extra little bit of detail and dynamic. And so I just wanted to get a few of those edges and a few of those feathers in the shadow area to stand out a little more than they were. And that's one of the things I like about acrylics, because they dry so quickly. I can go back and add these highlights shortly after that, and it's okay to go back and to change a few things to get that overall look that you're going for. So now I can go here with just titanium white and just do some of these top edges here just for that extra little bit of brightness. I really want that sunlight to feel really bright, where you've got this strong sunlight poking through a gap in the trees, lighting these swans up on this really bright winter day. Okay, I think that's looking really great. I'm just going to finish off a few of those details. Just kind of darken a couple shadows here and there just to finish off the overall look. And then now I can move down onto the feet. And I want to keep the details here fairly minimal. I don't want them to stand out too much. This is just going to be enough detail to give a hint of shape and a hint of a little bit of texture. So I'm just using kind of a bluish gray for some of these little highlights here, just so that you see a little bit of separation of detail. It also doesn't need much highlight, and the highlight itself probably wouldn't show up as much because this part of the snow and ice where the swan is standing is brightly lit by the sun. So you're not going to see a lot of that highlight detail. Really, this is just about the shape and getting a tiny bit of structure in there, and it has enough detail to look real. And then just on that bottom edge, just want to soften that harsh edge a little bit. And then I'm going to go in with a little bit of this orange color for the highlight on the swan's feet, and I think this is going to show up nicely to give that indication of the sun shining on the feet. That orange should stand out nicely on that slightly yellowish background. Then a little bit of a brighter orange. I've added a little bit more white and yellow oxide to this, something that'll just kind of help separate those two colors. And just a little bit in some of those tiny details, being sure not to overdo it too much, just a little bit here and there. Then I can use that dark shadow color and just refine those edges and bring that shadow right up to the swan's feet, make it feel like it's standing on the ice, really set it into the scene. And then I think that's looking really great. Just refine a few of these shadows, make sure that they look right, touch up a few of those details, and then I think that first swan is finished. Alright, so now we can work on the second swan, and I'm going to do this the exact same way I had done the first swan, where I start with some mid-range values, building up some highlights, deepening some shadows, refining feather details. The only difference here is that the posture of the swan is quite a bit different. The neck is in this sort of S shape, the wings are out and a little bit more loose, which means there's going to be a lot more complexity of the light and shadow shining on all these wing feathers. But I think it's going to add a really great dynamic to the scene, and it's really going to help with that glowing atmosphere and that glowing look of these two swans together. So I can start on the swan's head, and I can start with that mid-range value. I want the shadows on this swan's head to be slightly darker than the other. It feels like we might be getting a little bit less reflected light on this one, and naturally, because of the shape of the swan's neck, we're gonna get a deeper shadow underneath the swan's head where we get that tight little curl. Now, something I'm also doing here for some of these darker shadows is I'm adding just a tiny bit more of my alizarin crimson, which is going to help give that blue color a slight purple tint. And oftentimes for shadows and things like that, a slight purple tint in your shadows really helps push them back, giving them a little bit of a cooler color, which helps the shadows feel a little bit deeper. So now just softening some of those edges with a slightly lighter color. Paying attention to the shape, the direction of light, the reflected light from the skylight. And like I'd done on the first swan, the darkest shadow on the swan's head and neck is going to be right next to the highlight color. So we'll just add that deeper shadow right on the edge of that highlight, and then underneath the swan's head. And this is where having paintbrushes with nice fine sharp points are really good for handling nice fine details. And you don't necessarily need the smallest brush to do this. Here I'm using a round number 2, but it's a new brush that has a nice fine point, so I'm able to get all these really nice sharp details out of a fine pointed brush. And then I can just add a bit of a lighter blue color for that highlight coming from the sky. That's going to really help it stand out against the background. Which is also something I want to mention about this painting, is that I wanted it to be really high contrast and for the sunlight on these swans to stand out quite a bit. So I've put them against a dark background, that dark blue that you see behind the swan here. And if you put an animal in sunlight against a dark background, that sunlight is going to feel a lot brighter on that animal than if it was against a lighter background. That's not always the case, but in this painting, I wanted that high contrast look, so I put the swans in this scene where there would be a really deep blue shadow on the other side of this little lake. So now I can go into some of that yellow color that's just going to be on the edge of that shadow, helping to give it that nice 3D shape, where the light's going to slowly get dimmer as we go closer and closer to our shadow line, bringing a little bit of that yellow onto the swan's face where there might be just the tiniest hint of sunlight. All this work that I put into these base colors is what really helps the highlights show. You really want your highlights to be separated by nice shadows, even if they're very slight and very subtle. And then I can go in with my bright highlight, remembering to keep most of my paint and my brightest highlight just to the outer edge of where the sun is shining, just on the back of the swan's head and neck. And then slowly bringing some of those details further in towards the shadow. Giving a little bit more separation, not making them quite as strong as on the edge. Paying attention to that rounded shape. And then just a tiny bit of highlight on the side of the swan's head. And then I can go in with just titanium white just on that outer edge, just for that extra brightness. And I think that looks really great. And I thought that once I'd put that bright highlight on, that shadow under the head could be just a tiny bit darker. So I'll just refine that, do it very delicately, make sure I don't put too much on there. And then I can work on the swan's beak. Again, not incredibly strong details, just light, just enough to give it that shape and a hint of some of that detail. And then that dark reddish orange part. The nostril. And then I can go in with a slightly lighter color just to give it a little hint of those raised areas. And even though the highlight on the top edge of the beak is not quite as bright as this in my reference photo, I felt like it needed to be just a tiny bit brighter so that it would stand out with the rest of the bird. And then into the little tiny highlight into the eye, just very, very slight, just the tiniest little dot. Okay, I think that looks really great. That's a great start for this swan. Maybe deepen that shadow just a tiny bit. I always go back and just kind of do a last little few touches here and there. For the underside of the other wing, I just want to make a neutral gray that's got a slight brownish tint to it. So my white and my black, a little bit of alizarin crimson, a little bit of raw umber, and I might just add a touch of the ultramarine. I really like this part and this small detail of this swan where you can see just a little bit of the underside of the other wing. Now, it's not really reflecting any skylight or any sunlight, so I do start out with this neutral gray, and I will bring in just a few tiny parts where it is reflecting some of that skylight and getting a little bit of that sunlight. But for now, I'll just start with a little bit of this neutral gray that's got a slight tint of brown and alizarin crimson to it. And then I can start adding that highlight of that very, very slight yellow color to the top edge of this wing where we are getting a little bit of that glow from the sun. The light shines through a lot of these feathers quite a bit, so I am trying to keep that in mind a little bit as I follow my reference photo and make sure that I'm getting that transparency in this part of the wing that's going to show a little bit of that light through. This is the only part of these birds that are like this, and so it really adds a nice little dynamic and just a little bit of a different color to the entire scene. So a little bit of that blue color just on that back edge. And then I can do the top edge of these feathers with my highlight mixture, getting that nice bright sunlight. Maybe just a few other spots down into the wing. I don't want to overdo this highlight. I want to keep it as much to the top edge as possible. And just a little bit on these other parts just to give some feather definition. And then I think I'm going to come back with that very light yellow just in a few certain spots. Felt like it needed just a tiny bit more of that transparency. And then I can go with my titanium white and just go over those top edges again just to make it extra bright. Alright, so now I can start on the swan's body, and if you've stayed with me up until this point, thank you so much for joining me on this journey, and thank you for your patience. A painting like this with a lot of dynamic and a lot of light can take a ton of time. Like I had said before, I worked on these swans for about 5 days total, and so if you're going to do a painting like this, if you're going to do these swans or you're going to do other animals that have lots of dynamic, lots of sunlight and complicated details, then it's just going to take some time. So have some patience, enjoy the process, build up the layers. If you make a mistake, if you see something that needs to be fixed, it's okay. Make the change, make the adjustment. I'm constantly adjusting what I'm doing as I paint it. I see a little mistake or I see something that needs to be corrected and I go back and I fix it. It's important to just continue the process, learn as you go, figure out these steps as you take them, and then slowly but surely that painting, that animal will come to life. So now I can add that dark shadow that's between the neck and the wing. And then refining the shadows where all these little feathers are that curve around the neck and down onto the belly of the bird. Just be mindful to keep this shadow slightly darker. We're not going to have any reflected light like we did on the other one, where this swan is reflecting some of its sunlight onto the side of the other swan. And another thing as well that'll help is if the shadows are just slightly darker and there's just a little bit more contrast, it can help bring that foreground animal a little bit closer. Okay, and now on to some of the darker shadow parts that are on the wing. And here I just want to get some shape. I am going to refine these edges and soften them a little bit later, but here I just want to find all the dark shadow lines, get them in place. The shadows on this wing are quite a bit darker than the one before. And it's going to take me a little bit longer, and I'm going to be a little bit more precise with how each feather comes together, because there's going to be so many different parts where there's light and shadow. A little bit of that glowing light where the feathers are slightly transparent and letting that sunlight through. I'll go back with my slightly lighter value and just kind of bring those shadows up into the highlight. And then a little bit of a lighter shadow for some of those individual feathers that are just getting lit by the sun. Trying to build in some of that highlight from the sky, just on that outer edge of that wing. So I'll just keep refining some of these feathers, some of those primary flight feathers and secondary flight feathers. And I'll kind of jump around a little bit here while I've got this one color mixed, just to make sure that I get all those shadow areas with this same color in all the areas that I need them. And I am stepping back from time to time and leaning back just to make sure that I'm looking at the overall picture and how the swans fit into the picture as a whole, just to make sure that all these shadow colors and all these details make sense. Sometimes when I'm looking at the bird up close while I'm doing all these fine details, I can kind of lose a sense of the whole picture. So I do like to get up and stand back from time to time just to make sure it all works together. And then I can go in with a little bit of a darker shadow. I felt like it needed to be just ever so slightly darker on that line between the neck and the wing, and just on the underside of the belly here, just a slightly darker shadow. And I think that looks really great. I think that shadow just helped bring in a little bit more contrast, give it a stronger sense of direction of light. And then I think I'm going to bring some of that dark color into some of these other parts that I see could use a tiny bit more contrast as well. Not very much, just a little bit. Now I can go in with that highlight color and just go on some of these top edges. Now I want it to look a lot stronger than the other swan because these feathers are kind of sticking out a little bit more. The other swan, the feathers were a little bit closer to its body, a little bit more tucked in and tighter against the entire shape. Here the feathers are a bit looser, so they're sticking out. There's a lot more high points that are coming out, so I really want to have these highlights just a tiny bit lighter so that each one of these shapes has a little bit more structure to it than just looking like all the feathers are flat against the bird's body. I've gone back to a bit of a mid-range value just to kind of clean up a few things. And then back to a bit of a brighter highlight color that one that I used before wasn't quite bright enough. And I think this one should be good here. Again, making sure that that highlight color isn't as bright as my sunlight color. And then I can start bringing some of this shadow color into where the highlight is going to start. And I like to overlap it into the highlight just a little bit so that I can get a nice clean edge when I then bring this highlight color over top of those shadows. I get a bit of a finer edge and I can decide where some of those highlights are supposed to go without having to go back and fill in those shadows again. So now I can just finish filling in that highlighted area with my slightly yellowish base color. Already trying to build in that slightly transparent look. Just trying to get all these little edges where the sun is just kind of peeking through. This is where I find it's important to really look at the reference photo and study it and make sure that you're getting all those tiny little sunlit parts in your image in the exact place they're supposed to be. I have done it before where I've made up a sunlit scene where the animal wasn't lit by the sun originally in the photo that I was referencing, but it's a lot more challenging to do because it's hard to know exactly where the sun is going to be striking the feathers or the fur. So I really do like to follow that reference photo fairly closely so that it looks nice and natural and nice and real. And then I can add a little bit more of a deeper yellow, so a little more yellow oxide, a little more raw umber, a tiny bit more alizarin crimson. This will help for defining some of those feather shapes in the sunlit parts, a tiny bit of those shadows. Again, like I've said before, I really want it to look like it's glowing, and swan feathers sometimes can have a little bit of a yellow tint when they're lit by the sun, and so that's really going to help that overall look. And then the part on the belly that's being lit by the reflected sunlight from the ice. And then underneath the tail where I've gone just a tiny bit darker, just for that base color. Then I can add a slight highlight, remembering that the light being reflected off the ice is quite a bit more diffused and not as strong as the direct sunlight. And I can go back, just make sure I've got all those little edges, all those little spaces between those feathers, building that nice base for when I'm ready for my highlight. Okay, now I can start in with my highlight color. My favorite part is bringing this bright highlight in there. It really brings the bird to life. And then I'm just going to follow all those feather shapes that I built up, that I spent all this time working on, all those shadows that are in place that now when I put the highlight on, it's just that final finishing touch. And then a few in just these small little spaces where the sunlight is just sneaking through. And then down onto these larger primary feathers where they are mostly lit by the sun. And again, this isn't my brightest highlight. This is the titanium white with the yellow oxide. I'm saving the brightest highlight for last, which is just titanium white. That'll really help build a gradient within the highlight color, is by not using my brightest color even here when I'm doing most of the highlights. And then on just some of these little feathers here, just a small amount of highlight. And then just on a few of these other ones. And I am kind of going back and forth over some of these spots that I've already gone over already, just because titanium white does have a tendency to go on a little bit transparent. So on this one, when I want to get a little bit more of an opaque, stronger highlight, I'll have to go back over some of these areas and just layer them a tiny bit more. There's a lot to highlight on this one, and I just want to make sure that I get each and every feather that's supposed to be highlighted. And then I'm going to go back with a little bit more of my yellowish tan color and just kind of soften up a little bit of these edges here. I found that they maybe were a tiny bit too harsh, and I can just kind of soften some of that up. And then I'm going to go back with a little bit of a darker color. I noticed that once I had the bright highlights in there, a couple of those shadows weren't quite dark enough. And now I can go in with just titanium white, and you can see how much brighter that is than the color that I'd put down just before that. And I really like how strong that looks on top of those other colors. Really makes those feathers just stand out and pop. So I'm just going to go on some of the outer edges, really get that nice direction of light. Then onto the top edges of some of these primary feathers. And you can see how much that shadow color is really showing up underneath from all that work that we did before. And that's just helping it give it that dynamic even within that sunlit part. Rather than if all these feathers were just flat and completely white, it might look really bright, but it wouldn't have that structure and that three-dimensional shape. Okay, that is looking really great. Just going to add a few more details, make sure all the highlights and everything are in the right place. And I think that looks great so far, and we are nearly done. Okay, so now the last thing to do is just this foot. This swan is resting only on its right foot, so that's all we've got to do. Again, with just a little bit of detail. Nothing too overly complicated. A tiny bit of that highlight, just so that we can see some of that separation with the little toes. And then a tiny bit of a highlight color, just to make some of those edges stand out. I'll just soften that top edge there, just so it's not such a harsh line. Just around the nail. And then I can use that orange color again, which is my cadmium red light, my raw umber, a little bit of yellow oxide and some white. And then I can lighten that color up just to make that highlight stand out a little bit more. Clean up the edges of the shadow. Make it feel like it's standing on that ice. This will really help set it into the scene. And there we go. That second swan is looking really great, and I'm very happy with how everything came together. I'm just going to clean up a few final details, make sure everything looks right and fits together, and then I think with that, I've got a finished painting. I'm so happy with how these two swans came together. The bright highlights, that glowing quality, the really great blue sky shadows. I love the way that these two swans have brought life to this winter scene. So I appreciate you following me along on a bit of a longer journey to paint these swans. Thank you so much for watching.